They gave us a number before they gave us a sentence. Cognitive Threat Index 7.4 feet. That was what the architects stamped on the settlement file for Harrow's Rest the morning the council vote cleared. 7 and 4 out of a possible 10. High enough to mandate a full sterilization sweep rather than the standard suppression protocol. High enough that they sent 3 compliance vessels instead of 1. I found out about the vote 6 hours before the fleet broke atmosphere. Risa told me. She worked intake at the transit hub. One of those jobs the architects permitted, because it required no imagination. Just a body in a chair processing boarding manifests. And she'd been feeding information to our small, frightened network for 2 years. She came to my room in the lower quarter at 4 in the morning, knocked twice and then once, the way we'd agreed, and when I opened the door, her face told me everything before her mouth did. The vote passed, she said, 41-0. I asked her what 41-0 meant in practical terms, and she told me it meant the fleet was already in transit. It meant the neural suppression grid would go active the moment the lead vessel achieved low orbit, and it meant anyone the grid tagged as a dreamer would either be taken for cognitive restructuring or, if they ran, simply removed. Removed. That was the word the architects used. Clean and bureaucratic, the way they liked everything. I told Risa to go. I told her to get on a transit manifest going anywhere that wasn't Harrow's Rest, and to do it before dawn, she argued. She always argued. I told her the network needed people who weren't tagged, people who could move freely, people who could carry what we knew to wherever was next. She left. I don't know if she made it. I want to be precise about what I am, because the architects were never precise about it, and that imprecision is part of how they justified what they did. I am not a telepath. I do not broadcast. I cannot move objects or ignite fires or bend metal with my mind. What I can do, what dreamers do, is generate. In the intervals between waking and sleep, in moments of sustained focus or sudden shock, our minds produce what the architects call unauthorized cognitive artifacts. Images, sensory impressions, fully realized spatial environments that exist. Briefly, in a state the architect's instruments can detect but cannot model. They can see the output. They cannot predict the content. They cannot intercept the generation process. They cannot understand the mechanism. That last part was the problem. The architects ran the galaxy the way a comptroller runs a ledger. Every inhabited system had a cognitive baseline, a measurable average of mental activity, that the council monitored through the relay grid they'd built across 12,000 years of expansion. Baseline deviation was tolerated within narrow bands. Religion, art, music. These generated detectable spikes, but the spikes were patterned, predictable, mappable. The council had models for all of them. Dreamers broke the models. When I generated, the instruments registered a cognitive output they could neither categorize nor contain. The artifact bloomed and collapsed in seconds. But in those seconds, every node in the relay grid, within a 300-kilometer radius, registered the event and flagged it. The flag went to the regional compliance office. The compliance office sent a field unit. The field unit knocked on your door. The first time they came for me, I was 11 years old. I'd been asleep in the back room of my father's machine shop, and I'd dreamed, really dreamed, the kind of dreaming that spills out of you and into the room, the kind the architects can see. And I woke to the sound of my father's voice in the front, and 3 gray shapes moving past the window. My father was not a dreamer. He understood what I was, and he was frightened of it, and he loved me anyway, which is the bravest thing I've ever witnessed a person do. He stalled them for 20 minutes with paperwork questions, maintenance requests, complaints about the grid relay on our block that kept interfering with his tools. 20 minutes was enough for me to get out the back and into the service tunnels under the quarter. I was 11. I knew the tunnels by the smell of them. I ran until I didn't hear anything anymore, and then I sat in the dark for a very long time. That was 22 years ago. I had been running in one form or another ever since. Running teaches you things that other kinds of living do not. It teaches you how to read a street for compliance patrol patterns, the rhythm of vehicle passes, the timing of checkpoint shifts, the locations where the grid relay nodes have dead angles because the infrastructure is old and the maintenance backlog is long. It Teach it which kinds of people will let you sleep in their storage room without asking questions and which ones will flag you within the hour. It teaches you how much of your own nature you can compress before the compression starts doing damage you can't see until it's already done. I had gotten very good at compression. That was what 22 years of running bought you. Not safety. There was no such thing, not for a dreamer, not with the relay grid logging every generation event in real time. Just a longer interval between flags, between the field units showing up, between the scramble through service accesses, and the reset in a new settlement under a new manifest. Harrow's Rest was my 7th settlement in 16 years. I had chosen it for the same reason I chose all of them. Old infrastructure, poor relay coverage in the lower quarters, compliance office that was understaffed relative to its assigned population. Safe, just manageable. Just enough of a margin that I could live for a few years without the constant cost of full compression. By the time Risa knocked on my door with the council's verdict, I had been at Harrow's Rest for 3 years, long enough to know the streets, the service accesses, the patrol rhythms of the compliance field units, long enough to have made contact with 5 other dreamers living scattered through the settlement. Orlin, a wire-thin man in his 60s, who repaired atmospheric processors and dreamed in colors that had no names in any language he knew. Maeve, a woman who had once worked as a cartographer for the Transit Authority before her 3rd flag, and now lived under a false manifest. Kel, who was young enough that he hadn't fully understood yet what he was, only that something in him kept making the instruments scream. The twins, Sola and Finn, who dreamed in tandem, and whose generated artifacts were so coherent, so sustained, that the architects had classified them as a Category C threat, the highest designation they issued to individual persons. Twins had found me rather than the other way around. That was unusual. Usually I was the one who identified the others, the flagged names in compliance intake reports. Risa forwarded the behavioral patterns I'd learned to read in a settlement's population, the particular quality of stillness in a person who had learned to make themselves invisible. Sola and Finn didn't bother with stillness. They were 34 years old, both of them, and they had been on the run together since they were 19. Since the night a compliance sweep in their home settlement had taken their parents, and they had generated, simultaneously and without control, an artifact so large and sustained that the field team's instruments had failed entirely, and in the confusion they had run and kept running. 15 years of running together. They came to my door in the lower quarter 6 months after I arrived at Harrow's Rest, which was not the signal I used with Risa but was a number I'd told no one. I had stood there for a long moment with my hand on the door handle, running the calculus of whether this was a compliance trick or something else. And Finn's voice came through the door and said, "We know you're in there and we know you're doing the same math we'd do, and we're not compliance. And it's cold. And we've been tracking you for 2 weeks, because we thought you might know something worth knowing." Shh. I opened the door. Shh. They were both shorter than I expected, both carrying that particular economy of movement that came from years of living with minimal footprint. Sola had a scar along her jaw from something she never explained. Finn had the eyes of someone who has had to think faster than the room for a very long time, and has gotten good at it. What they knew between them was considerable. They'd been running longer than I had, and they'd covered more ground. And in 15 years of being a Category C threat to the administered galaxy, they'd built a mental map of the compliance apparatus, its patterns, its limitations, its specific regional variations, that was more detailed than anything I'd assembled. In exchange for what I knew about Harrow's Rest's infrastructure, they shared that map. We sat in my room until well past midnight, and talking through routes and timelines, and the specific names of compliance officers in various systems who were known to be manageable, versus the ones who were not. And by the time they left, I understood that I'd been thinking about survival in a narrower way than the situation called for. They hadn't tried to organize anything. That was important. They didn't have a plan or a network or a structure. They had information, and they shared it freely, and they didn't ask for anything in return except to be treated as people, rather than assets, which I understood because I wanted the same thing, and had wanted it for 22 years. Sure. I added them to the list in my head. I kept them separate from the others because that was operational logic. But I knew, in the way you know things you haven't fully said to yourself yet, that the separation was a courtesy to my own fear, rather than a genuine tactical necessity. We were already connected. We had been connected the moment they knocked. The moment I heard Finn's voice through the door and understood that I was not, in fact, the only person in this settlement who had been doing this alone. I had not told any of them about each other. That was standard operational logic. If one of us was taken and cognitively restructured, they could only give what they knew, and what they knew was one name. The morning after Risa's visit, I went to each of them in turn, and I told them the same thing I'd told Risa. Go. Take nothing identifiable. Get on a transit manifest before the suppression grid went active. Do not wait for me. None of them went. I should have known they wouldn't. That was the other thing about dreamers, that the architect's models never captured. The stubbornness, the specific, irrational, deeply human tendency to stay in a burning building because someone you care about is still inside. Logic could not account for it. The architect's models were built entirely on logic, on the assumption that a rational entity, confronted with a quantifiable threat, would execute the behavior most likely to preserve its existence. That was how they thought. That was how they had always thought. 12,000 years of expanding administrative control built on the premise that all conscious entities were at base rational optimizers. They were wrong about that the way they were wrong about us. The two errors were not unrelated. The fleet broke atmosphere at 0900. I was standing at the edge of the market quarter when it happened. Compliance vessels, wide-body configuration, the kind they used for planetary operations, rather than individual retrieval. They came down in a loose triangle formation and held at high altitude. And I watched the relay nodes along the roof lines begin to pulse with the blue-white light that meant the suppression grid was initializing. The market quarter went quiet in the particular way that places go quiet, when people understand that something has changed and do not yet know what it means for them personally. Vendors paused mid-transaction. A pair of children stopped running in the street and looked up. The noise of ordinary settlement life, the mechanical hum, the transit frequency, the layered ambient sound of a few 100,000 people going about their days. All of it receded, and in the receding you could hear the grid itself if you were a dreamer. A low subsonic oscillation that wasn't sound exactly but registered in the body as sound. The specific frequency of suppression. The grid worked by broadcasting a low-level inhibitory signal tuned to the cognitive frequency range associated with dreamer generation. For most people, it did nothing. Dreamers, it was like trying to breathe underwater. Not instantly lethal, but wrong in a way that built and built until the body began to panic. Extended exposure caused cognitive degradation. That was the polite term. For what happened to the people they took for restructuring? The ones who came back were functional. They held jobs, maintained manifests, passed every cognitive screening. They just didn't dream anymore. They were quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. When you spent years running, you learned to read the people around you. Posture, pace, eye pattern, the 1,000 small behavioral signals that told you who was managing something private and who was not. Restructured had a specific quality to them. Not dull, not broken exactly. More like a lamp that had been burning full and then reduced to the lowest setting that kept the filament alive. Everything present, nothing lit. I had resolved early that I would not be restructured. I had not resolved what the alternative was. I had spent 22 years not resolving it, which was its own kind of answer. The grid came fully active at 0930. I felt it immediately. A pressure behind the eyes, a narrowing, as if the room I was standing in had grown slightly smaller without moving its walls. I had experienced the grid before in other settlements, during other sweeps, and I knew I had roughly 6 hours before the pressure became something I couldn't ignore, and roughly 12 before it became dangerous. I also knew that somewhere in the settlement, Kel, young, unschooled, with no experience managing what the grid did to a dreamer's nervous system, was going to panic. I found him 40 minutes later in the housing block where he lived with his uncle. The uncle had already been escorted out. I saw the compliance unit's transport pulling away from the building as I came around the corner. Kel was on the roof. I got up there through the maintenance stair and found him sitting against the ventilation housing with his knees pulled to his chest. His eyes too wide, his hands shaking with a fine tremor. I recognized. He was generating, under the suppression grid. With his body already reacting and his fear spiking hard, he was generating without intending to, the way a wound bleeds without permission. The artifacts were small, flickers, half-formed shapes that bloomed and dissolved in the air around him. But they were visible, and every one of them was lighting up the grid and sending a flag. I sat down next to him on the gravel of the roof and I talked to him the way my father had talked to me in the machine shop, the night he'd found me trying to understand what I was. Quiet voice, concrete words, nothing about the danger, or the grid, or the compliance units that were already, certainly, moving toward our location. Just the next thing. Just the next breath, the next thought, the shape of the sky. What the clouds looked like from here. What the compliance vessels looked like from a distance. Just shapes, just machinery, just metal in the air. Not a sentence, just objects. It was the approach my father had used on me, and I had never fully understood why it worked until I was older and could think about it clearly. When you are generating without control, your mind is following fear, chasing the thing it's afraid of, amplifying it. The way out is not to stop the mind but to redirect it, to give it something concrete and immediate and manageable to attend to. Something that requires observation rather than anticipation. Fear lives in the future. Attention lives in the present. You cannot generate from pure attention, not the way fear generates. The body quiets. It took 15 minutes. I don't know that I would have lasted 15 minutes if our situations had been reversed. Kel was stronger than he knew. The artifact slowed, stopped. He looked at me and said, "Where's my uncle?" And I told him the truth. "I don't know, and we have to move now, and I'm sorry." We moved. The compliance units had the major transit routes covered. They'd had a manifest of residence since before they broke atmosphere. That was standard procedure. A complete demographic scan of the settlement filed with the regional office 60 days prior to any suppression action. Every dreamer on that manifest had a flag. The grid told them where the flags were lighting up in real time. We stayed in the service tunnels, and the sub-level conduits, moving by the maintenance schedules I'd memorized over 3 years of making sure I always had a way out. The sub-level network under the lower quarter was old enough that several sections didn't appear on any official infrastructure map. They predated the current settlement layout, remnants of the original extraction site's utility runs, and the maintenance crews who used them did so by institutional memory rather than filed documentation. The architects' ground teams would have the official maps. They would not have the memory. Kel was quiet and functional, and did exactly what I told him to do, which was the difference between being caught and not being caught, in my experience. People who argued or froze or needed to understand the whole plan before they moved a single step, those were the people who got taken. Not because arguing was wrong. Not because the plan didn't deserve scrutiny. Because in the specific circumstances of a compliance sweep with a suppression grid, active and a flag on your name, the time for argument was not now, and the plan was whatever got you from here to somewhere that wasn't here. We found Orlin at his workshop in the processor district, still at his bench, still running his repair tickets, as if the 3 compliance vessels hanging over the settlement were a weather event he'd decided to wait out. I had known Orlin for a year and a half, and in that time I had never seen him hurry. He had survived 4 suppression sweeps in 3 different settlements over 40 years. And his survival strategy appeared to be a complete and absolute refusal to behave as if anything unusual was happening. He looked up when we came through the service access and said, "I expected you sooner." I told him we needed to move. He said he knew. He had a bag already packed under the bench. He'd been ready for 3 days. He just hadn't seen the point in going anywhere until there was somewhere to go. That was Orlin in full. Not careless. Passive. Just genuinely, functionally unimpressed by urgency. He had earned it honestly. 40 years of being the thing the galaxy's administrative apparatus had decided was a threat to its stability had given him a very clear-eyed sense of what constituted an emergencies and what constituted a situation he had already prepared for. I didn't have somewhere to go. I had a direction. The visions had been building for 6 weeks. I need to explain this carefully, because it sits at the center of everything followed, and the architects. When they finally filed their incident report on Harrow's Rest, described it as a coordinated insurgent communication network, and attributed it to deliberate planning. It was not that. I don't know what it was precisely. I know what it felt like, and I know what it led to, and those two facts will have to be enough. 6 weeks before the fleet arrived, I began seeing her. Not with my eyes. The visions came the way generation always came. In the space between states, in the half-second gap between one thought and the next, arriving whole and precise the way generated artifacts did, rather than the fragmentary, personal symbol way that ordinary dreams arrived. Psst. A woman. Dark coat, close-cropped hair going gray at the temples. A specific stillness to the way she stood that was not calm but something harder. The stillness of a person who had been very afraid for a very long time and had made a decision about it. She was always at a distance. Always in a space I didn't recognize. Vast and high-ceilinged, lit with a quality of light I couldn't place, surrounded by shapes that weren't quite architecture and weren't quite terrain. She never moved toward me. She never spoke. She looked at me the way you look at something you've been waiting for. I had told no one. I had run the possibility that the visions were a grid manipulation, that the architects were using the suppression frequency to project false images, to draw dreamers toward a location, and I couldn't rule it out. I'd heard of that technique, theoretically. I'd never seen evidence it was real. But I couldn't rule it out. What I could say was that the direction was consistent. Every vision placed her in the same direction relative to where I was standing. Northeast, toward the edge of the settlement and the industrial processing corridor beyond, where the atmosphere management infrastructure ran in long, low buildings, and the compliance patrols were thin, because the grid relay was densest there, and the architects believed their instruments were sufficient. That was where I was taking us. Maeve found us first, or we found each other, at a junction in the sub-level conduit system where we'd both had the same operational logic about how to cross the processor district unseen. She had a cut on her forearm from somewhere, bandaged with what looked like packing material, and she was moving with the particular focused efficiency of someone who had already done the math on their situation and didn't find the results upsetting anymore. Just factual. She looked at me and said, "Northeast corridor." I said yes. She said, "How long have you been seeing her?" 6 weeks. She said 8 for me. She nodded at Orlin and Kel. Them too? Orlin said the visions had started 11 weeks ago. He said it in the same tone he said everything. Level unhurried, as if 11 weeks of recurring visions of an unknown woman in an unknown location were a mildly interesting repair ticket. Kel said he didn't know what we were talking about. Then his eyes changed slightly and he said, "The woman who stands still." Maeve said, "That's her." We moved northeast. The compliance units found us in the conduit junctions at the edge of the processor district. I had known they would. The suppression grid had us all flagged, and the grid was getting to Kel again. Small, involuntary artifacts flickering at the edges of his vision, whether he intended them or not. There were 4 units in the first intercept team, and they had the standard configuration. 2 with the cognitive disruptors that could drop a dreamer's generation capacity to zero in under a second. 2 with physical containment. Professional. Practiced. They had done this many times in many settlements. What they hadn't done was manage 4 dreamers at once in an enclosed space. When the disruptors fired, all 4 of us generated simultaneously. I don't know if it was a coordinated response. It didn't feel like a decision. It felt like a reflex. The way your hands come up when something comes at your face. 4 artifacts bloomed in the narrow conduit junction in the same instant, and the space between us and the compliance team became briefly, violently unreliable. Not an attack, not a weapon. Just 4 human minds, pushed to the wall, spilling out what was inside them in the only direction available. Orlin's generation was always the same. The colors with no names. The rolling visual landscape that came from 40 years of compressed dreaming. It filled the upper half of the conscious with something that looked like weather and felt like standing at the edge of a very high place. Maeve's was cartographic. She had spent years making maps, and her mind made maps even now. The conduit junction suddenly overlaid with a spatial model of every route she'd memorized, glowing and branching in the air like a river delta seen from altitude. Mine came without decision. The machine shop, my father's hands on a piece of equipment. The smell of metal and oil, so precise and complete that the officers closest to it stumbled. Not because it was threatening, but because it was real in the way that generated artifacts were real. Fully sensory, and the sensory data of that specific room was not what any part of their nervous systems was prepared to receive in this context. Kel's was biggest. Kel was 17 and uncompressed, and when he generated under genuine fear, there was no ceiling on it. What came out of him was a sky, a full sky event, a dome of stars and color that replaced the conduit ceiling entirely, that had no connection to the industrial infrastructure around it. That was simply and completely the night sky, as Kel experienced it in whatever interior space he had built over 17 years of dreaming. It was extraordinary. It was the kind of generation that got a Category A flag in the incident log, and a note about escalated response. One of the compliance officers dropped his disruptor. I heard it clatter on the deck. The other three broke left. That was all we needed. We ran. Ortlin was slower than the rest of us, and Kel went back for him without being asked, and I didn't see what happens behind us because I was running, and the grid pressure was bad now. A genuine pain sitting in the middle of my skull. And Maeve was running beside me, and ahead of us the service corridor opened into the light of the processor district's eastern edge. And beyond that was the industrial corridor. And beyond that, in a direction that felt like gravity, was whatever we were moving toward. We lost the compliance team. I don't know how, entirely. I think the simultaneous generation had scrambled the grid readings in that section, given us a few minutes of instrument blindness. We came out of the processor district on foot, 4 people in work clothes, with no manifests and no clearance. And we walked into the industrial corridor, and nobody stopped us. The buildings in the industrial corridor were old, council infrastructure, the kind that predated the relay grid, built when Harrow's Rest was a raw extraction site before the survey teams had finished reclassifying it as a settlement. The atmosphere management machinery ran in long, low-pitched halls with ceiling spans wide enough to park transit vessels in, and the air smelled of processed filtrate and hot metal, and something beneath that. Something organic faint, like the smell of a room where a lot of people have been thinking hard for a very long time. Maeve touched my arm and pointed. There was a door at the far end of the corridor, not a service access, not a maintenance hatch, a real door, framed with a light above it that was on. In a corridor full of dark doorways and sealed accesses, one door with a light on. I went to it. There was no panel, no lock interface, no manifest reader. Just a door. I opened it and went through. The space inside was what I had been seeing in the visions for 6 weeks, and it was exactly right. The height, the quality of the light, the shapes along the walls, that I understood now, were people. People sitting, standing, some on the floor, arranged without apparent organization, but with a density that suggested they had been gathering for some time. 40, I thought at first. Then I looked more carefully and I counted more than 100. She was at the center. Dark coat, close-cropped hair going gray. The stillness I recognized. She looked at me and said, I wasn't sure the grid would slow you down enough for us to all be here. I said, what is this? She said. Her name was Blue. And this was the part where she explained something the architects had gotten wrong for 12,000 years. She had been a cognitive researcher before. Part of the survey apparatus the council used to establish baselines in newly classified settlements. She had access to data most people never saw. The raw cognitive telemetry from 12,000 years of relay grid monitoring. The full database of flag generation events. The models the architects had built and rebuilt, trying to understand what dreamers were. The models were wrong, she told us. Not slightly wrong. Categorically wrong at the foundation. The architects understood dreamer generation as an isolated event. One mind, producing one artifact, registered by the grid, flagged, suppressed. Each event disconnected from every other event. Each dreamer a separate anomaly to be managed individually. What the raw telemetry actually showed. If you looked at the full dataset across 12,000 years, rather than the individual incident logs the compliance offices used, was a pattern. Generation events across different systems, separated by hundreds of light years and decades of time, were not random. They were convergent. When you mapped them, when you tracked the frequency and the content of what was generated across the full span of the data, they were moving towards something. Building towards something, each individual artifact apparently meaningless, but the aggregate, the sum of 100,000 dreamers generating over 12,000 years, describing a structure so large that no single compliance office, looking only at its own region's incident logs, would ever see it. Blue had seen it. She had been trying to understand what it meant for 9 years before the compliance office in her home system flagged her for the first time. By then, she had already hidden copies of the analysis in 14 locations the Council had no record of. By then, she already knew that the structure the generation events were building toward had a location, a specific point in the cognitive topography of the galaxy, mapped by 12,000 years of dreaming, where something waited. Not a weapon, not a transmission, not a piece of military infrastructure, a door. I want to be careful here because I don't want to overstate what I understood in that room and what I only understood later. At the time, what Blue told us was operational, specific, and urgent. The generation events had been building toward a moment of threshold, and the threshold was close. And the Council's suppression campaign was accelerating specifically because something in the relay grid data had flagged the convergence pattern as anomalous, and the architects, even without understanding what they were seeing, had recognized that the pace of dreamer activity across the galaxy was increasing toward a point. They were trying to stop it. That was what the 41-0 vote was really about. Not Harrow's Rest specifically, not the 112 people in this room specifically. The Council had 18 suppression actions running simultaneously across the inhabited systems, and they were running them all on an accelerated timeline because the Compliance Division had run the numbers. And the numbers said that if they didn't reach threshold suppression within the next 48 hours, they were going to be managing a cascade they had no model for. 48 hours, Orlin said. What happens at the threshold, Blue said. I don't know exactly. The data shows the convergence. The data doesn't show the outcome. But I know what the Council is afraid of. I've read the internal assessments. What they're afraid of is that when enough dreamers generate simultaneously in sufficient density, the artifacts stop being local events. They stop being individual, momentary, grid-flagged incidents. They become, she paused, looking for the word, permanent, stable, real. Kel said, you mean we make things? Blue said, I mean we make things that stay. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, I could hear the distant bass rumble of the compliance vessel's positioning thrusters. The grid pressure in my skull was a steady, insistent presence, tolerable but increasing, and I knew the rest of them felt it too. 112 people in a room, all of them carrying that same pressure, and the room itself felt charged with it. The air dense in a way that wasn't physical. I said, what do you need? Said, generate, all of us together, sustained. Not the reflex burst we produce when cornered. Sustained, deliberate. Everything we have, held open as long as we can hold it. The relay grid will register it as a cascade event. The cascade will propagate along the grid network to every dormant dreamer in every connected system. And when those dreamers generate in response, because they will, that's what the data shows, the cascade propagates. It wakes the ones who have been suppressed and suppressing themselves for years. The threshold tips. I said, and then what? She said, I told you, I don't know exactly. I said, the compliance units will come directly here. The moment we start generating, we light up every instrument they have. She said, yes. I said, how long do we need? She said, the models say 6 minutes. But the models are built on incomplete data. And said, 6 minutes is manageable. He said the same. He said everything, level, unhurried. Like it was a repair estimate. Not a sentence. I looked at the room. 112 people. I had been alone in this. Had been alone in the most fundamental sense, the sense of being a kind of person the administered galaxy had decided was a problem. For 22 years. I had learned to read dreamers the way you learned to read any population you moved through for a long time, And what I read in this room was not courage exactly. Not recklessness. People here had made the same calculation I had made. Each in their own way, at some point in their own running. That there was a difference between surviving and living, and that the difference was worth a price, and that the only question was whether you had found the moment when the price was payable. Spent 22 years not finding that moment. It had found me instead. We did it. I'm not going to tell you it was easy, or that I wasn't afraid. I was afraid, the way I had been afraid in the back of my father's machine shop when I was 11 years old, running from shapes in the dark, and the fear was exactly the same quality. The fear of something enormous that cannot be argued with, that does not care whether you are ready, that is coming regardless. The only difference was that this time I wasn't running. We sat. We opened. Every person in that room, 112 people who had been running and hiding and managing and compressing for years, decades, some of them most of their lives, stopped compressing. Came out was not tidy. It was not coordinated. It was 112 people generating without restraint for the first time most of them had ever done it, and the space around us became something the word room no longer described accurately. Artifacts bloomed and built and layered. Colors from Orland's vocabulary that had no names. Spatial structures that obeyed different rules than the building we were inside. Sounds and textures, and the physical sensation of temperatures and winds that corresponded to nothing in the industrial corridor, but were absolutely present and absolutely specific, drawn from 112 minds that had been these things for years and had never been allowed to put them down. Generated the machine shop again, not as a reflex this time, as a choice. Every detail I had carried for 22 years. The smell, the sound, the exact quality of the light through the back window, my father's hands on a piece of equipment he was explaining to me, the shape of his voice. I put it all down in that room. I held it open and I did not pull it back. It sat there in the layered space among 111 other people's held and impossible interiors, and it was exactly as real as any of them. No more, no less. Just one more room in the house that should never have existed, standing firm. The compliance team breached the door at 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I know this because Maeve had a timer running, and she told me later. I wasn't tracking time. I was deep in it, further than I had ever gone. The grid pressure irrelevant now. The pain gone. The generating not a reflex or a managed event, but something that felt for the first time in my life like the thing I was actually built to do. The compliance officers came through the door and stopped. I don't know what they experienced. I know what the room looked like from inside it, and I know that every instrument they were carrying was registering a cascade event at a scale that had no entry in their operational manual. I know that 2 of them backed out through the door immediately, and 1 of them stood there in the middle of what we were making, looking at it. Looking at the specific thing was generating, which was vast and precise and achingly beautiful in the way that very young people's inner worlds sometimes are, not yet edited, not yet managed. The night sky again. Stars he had named himself. Constellations that didn't match any catalog, but were internally consistent, specific, described in the particular detail of a mind that had spent 17 years making sense of a universe that had decided he was a problem. That officer's name was in the incident report later. I won't give it here. What I will say is that whatever he saw, he didn't raise his disruptor. 4 minutes and 50 seconds, Blue said. Now. She said it quietly, not a command, a signal. Like calling the moment when something that has been building finally arrives. The threshold broke at 5 minutes and 12 seconds. I know the number because the relay grid's own incident log recorded it. Every node in the network registered the event simultaneously, not a flag, not a localized anomaly, but a full grid cascade, propagating at the speed of the relay signal outward from Harrow's Rest, through every connected system in the inhabited galaxy. 12,000 light-years of relay network, 41,000 inhabited systems. Every dreamer in every one of those systems who had been suppressed, medicated, restructured, beaten quiet, frightened small, they all felt it at once. I have tried, in the time since, to understand what that felt like from the outside. From the perspective of a dreamer in a settlement on the far side of the inhabited systems. Someone who had never heard of Harrow's Rest, who had spent years managing and compressing and had been successful enough at it that the compliance office had no current flag on their name. What they would have felt was a loosening, a signal propagating through the relay grid at the speed of light, arriving at every connected node simultaneously. And what the signal carried was not a message, not language, not instruction, just the raw fact of 112 minds generating at full capacity without restraint, the cognitive equivalent of a shout in a silent room, and the response to a shout in a silent room, for a dreamer who had been silent for years, was to shout back. The Council's compliance vessels registered it 6 seconds later. The suppression grid over Harrow's Rest went into an overload shutdown that took their technical teams 4 hours to diagnose, and they never fully understood the cause. The 3 vessels broke atmosphere and held in high orbit, and the compliance teams on the ground stood in the streets of Harrow's Rest, with equipment that had stopped functioning and nothing in their training that covered what came next. Across the inhabited systems, 18 simultaneous suppression actions went dark. Not shut down. Dark. The instruments failed. The grid suppression frequency lost coherence. The field teams, standing in streets and service corridors and transit hubs across 12,001 light-years, all experienced the same thing at the same moment. Every reading they had went to 0, and then every reading they had went to maximum, and then their equipment stopped reporting anything at all. The cascade had not attacked the grid. It had simply exceeded every parameter the grid was designed to measure. The Council reconvened in emergency session 32 minutes later. I know this from the incident report, which was eventually made available through channels I won't specify. 31 council members, 0 absences. The record shows that the session lasted 4 minutes before it was adjourned without resolution, which is the shortest emergency session in the 12,000-year administrative record of the Galactic Council. What the record does not show is what the 41 council members experienced during those 4 minutes. I have my own theory. The cascade had propagated through the relay grid, and the relay grid connected the council's own chambers. The architects were not dreamers. They could not generate. They could receive, the way a room receives sound, passively and voluntarily, without any capacity to prevent or interpret what arrived. What arrived in that chamber was the aggregate of 41,000 simultaneous dreamer generation events. 12,000 years of suppressed human imagination, waking at once. I think about that room sometimes. 41 gray shapes around a table. Instruments reading nothing, voices processing nothing. Hive cognition encountering for the first time in 12,000 years of continuous operation, something it had absolutely no model for. Not a threat they could calculate. Not a variance they could suppress. Just the full, unmanaged, unstoppable fact of what the people they'd been hunting actually were. I came out of it slowly. That's the only way I can describe it. The way you come back to a room after being somewhere else, the physical space reasserting itself, the ordinary sensory data of walls and floor and air trickling back. Blue was sitting on the ground. Eyes were open, and she was looking at the ceiling. And she looked like a person who has just put down something extraordinarily heavy after a very long walk. Not relief exactly. Something quieter than relief. Something that looked to me like the face of someone who has finally finished a job they were handed, without asking for it. I sat down near her. The room around us was settling too. The artifacts fading to residue. The charged quality of the air dissipating. The 112 of us returning to ourselves in various states of exhaustion and something else. Not triumph. Not quite. The word I kept reaching for, and kept not finding exactly right, was recognition. As if every person in that room had just been told something they had always known, but had never been permitted to say out loud. Orlin was the one who broke the silence, he said. Practical question. What happens when the council reconvenes? Maeve said 41-0 vote. Orlin said yes, that's still a standing order. Blue said. The cascade changed what they're dealing with. The compliance manual has entries for suppression actions, individual retrieval, regional pacification. It has no entry for 41,000 simultaneous cascade events across the full relay network. Whatever the council does next, it takes them time to write a new protocol. Time is what we needed. I said, time for what? She said to not be alone. I thought about that. I had been alone in one way or another since I was 11 years old. I had run, hidden, managed, compressed. I had been careful, and I had been fast, and I had survived by treating my own nature as a liability to be controlled, rather than a thing that was simply true about me. 22 years of that. 22 years of being what the Council's filing system called a cognitive threat index entry, rather than a person. 12,000 light-years of network. 41,000 systems. Every dormant dreamer in the galaxy, now awake and now aware that there were others, that they weren't anomalies, that the word the architects used, threat, was accurate in the way that the architects would never admit. Not because we were dangerous in the way weapons were dangerous, but because we were evidence that the model they'd built the last 12,000 years around was incomplete, that the universe had room in it for things their instruments couldn't measure and their models couldn't contain. You can suppress a person, you can flag them and restructure them and reduce them to a compliance statistic. You cannot suppress a principle. You cannot restructure an idea that has already propagated across 41,000 systems and taken root in 40,000 minds. The Council would reconvene. They would issue new protocols. They would adapt, because they were nothing if not adaptive. 12,000 years of administrative efficiency, and they would find ways to manage what the cascade had changed. They would draw new lines, write new manuals, assign new cognitive threat index numbers to a situation that had moved significantly past the old scale. They were very good at management, but they would be managing it now, not eliminating it. There is a difference between a problem you can remove and a problem you have to manage, and the difference, in my experience, is that one of them ends, and one of them doesn't. The compliance officer who had stayed in the room, the one who stood there in Kel's sky and didn't raise his weapon, came to find me an hour later, said, he has a transport in the industrial corridor, and it would hold 30 people, and he wanted to know where we were going. I said I didn't know yet. He said, that's all right. His voice was different from when he'd come through the door. He looked like someone who had seen something that had rearranged his sense of what counted as a threat. Not converted. I want to be honest about that. Not someone who had changed everything he thought overnight. Just someone who had encountered a data point his existing models couldn't absorb cleanly, and was smart enough to know that meant the models needed work, rather than the data point needed suppression. I looked at Blue, still sitting on the floor, still wearing that particular expression. I looked at Kel, asleep against the wall, his face open in a way it hadn't been since before the grid went active. I looked at Orlin, already reviewing something in a small notebook, already making notes, already preparing for whatever the repair ticket on this turned out to be. I thought about my father in the machine shop stalling 3 gray shapes with paperwork questions. 20 minutes. Enough time for a frightened year-old to find his way out through a dark tunnel. That was what he had been doing. Not arguing with the principle of the thing. Not trying to explain what his son was. Just buying the next necessary minute. Just making room for what couldn't be stopped to move. I said to the compliance officer, we're going northeast. Trey, there are other settlements. There are people in them who just woke up for the first time and don't know what they are or that anyone else is like them. He nodded. He said, I know 2 of those settlements. I have patrol routes. That was enough. That was exactly as much as we needed right then. Not a plan, not a strategy, not a structure that could be filed with a regional office and reviewed for completeness. Just the next step. Just the next corridor. Just someone who knew the way. I thought about what Blue had called the door. Not a weapon, not a transmission. A door. I had turned that word over in my mind a dozen times since she said it, trying to understand what it meant in concrete terms. What a cognitive threshold event looked like from the outside of it. What the relay grid had actually been building toward across 12,000 years of flag generation events. I still didn't have a complete answer. I'm not sure anyone did. The data showed the convergence. It didn't narrate the destination. What I had instead was a working hypothesis, grounded in 3 years of being a dreamer in an administered galaxy. The door opened onto whatever was on the other side of the Council's model. The space outside the ledger, portion of the universe That 12,000 years of relay grid monitoring had been measuring without being able to see. The architects had built their empire on the premise that consciousness was a phenomenon that could be fully described, that every mental event was categorizable, measurable, suppressible, if it fell outside acceptable parameters. The relay grid was not surveillance in the political sense. It was, in their framework, a scientific instrument, a way of ensuring that the universe they administered remained the universe they had modeled. Predictable, consistent, closed. Dreamers had always been the counter-evidence. Not the only counter-evidence, probably. I suspected there were other things the model missed, other phenomena that fell outside the grid's measurement capacity, other aspects of consciousness or reality that 12,000 years of administrative certainty had simply decided not to see. Dreamers were the most visible counter-evidence, the most measurable in their own way, and so they had been the most aggressively suppressed. The door, I thought, was what became possible when the counter-evidence reached critical mass. When the thing that couldn't be modeled became too prevalent to exclude from the model. Not a weapon, not a transmission. Just the moment when the universe declined to be smaller than it was. I didn't know what came through a door like that. I didn't know if it was a place or a process or a change in the fundamental operating conditions of inhabited space. I knew what had come through this morning. 41,000 minds generating at once. The cascade, the grid failing. A compliance officer standing in a teenager's sky with his disruptor at his side. Maybe that was enough. Maybe the door was already open and what came through it was simply that. The fact of each other. The knowledge that we existed, spread across 41,000 systems, present and awake and no longer alone. Maybe that was what the architects had been afraid of all along. Not the artifacts, not the generation events. The contact. We walked out into the industrial corridor, 31 of us, into the thin morning light of a settlement. The suppression grid had gone dark, and the compliance vessels were sitting in high orbit, waiting for an order that hadn't been written yet. The air tasted like atmosphere, filtrate, and metal, and something alive under that. Something that had always been there and was only now audible. The streets of Harrow's Rest were quiet in a different way than they'd been quiet that morning. Not the quiet of held breath, of people waiting to understand what was coming. Something else. The compliance teams were still there. Standing at their posts, instruments dark, waiting for instructions that were taking longer than usual to arrive. People moved past them in the street. Nobody ran. We walked northeast 31 people, with no manifests and no clearance and nowhere specific to be. And the compliance officer walked with us. And I thought about 41,000 systems going bright at once, 100,000 people opening their eyes in the dark after years of keeping them shut. And I thought that the architects had been right about one thing at least. Sola and Finn fell into step beside me after the first block. Finn said, "I have a question." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "The council is going to come back with something. They always do. New protocol, new instrument calibration, new suppression frequency. They've had 12,000 years of practice adapting." I said, "Yes." He said, "So what's different this time?" I thought about it. I said, "Before today, every dreamer in every system thought they were the only one. Or, if they knew others existed in the abstract, they'd never felt it. Never felt the actual weight of 40,000 other minds generating at the same moment, the same signal, arriving from the same direction. The councils has been managing isolated individuals for 12,000 years. That's what their models are built for. Individual anomalies, case files, field units dispatched to one address at a time." Sola said, and now they have to build a model for what it looks like when the anomalies know about each other. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We should write that down. Everything we know about how they operate. All of it. Everything we've accumulated in all the years we've been running. Freaked. Write it down and find a way to get it to every person who woke up this morning, not knowing what they were." Psst. I looked at her. It was the kind of idea that was obvious in retrospect and invisible until someone said it. The kind of idea that came from a mind that had been thinking about the specific problem for 15 years and finally had the room to think about the next problem instead. I said yes. She said, "Finn's better at writing than I am." Finn said, "That's not true." She said, "It's entirely true." Lynn, without looking up from his notebook, said that he was also available and had in fact already started. I reflected, exactly what I would have predicted if I'd been capable of predicting anything that morning, which I had not been. Maeve pulled out her own notebook. The cartographer's habit, never without something to record spatial data in, and said she'd been mapping the route we'd taken from the conduit junctions, and she could have a passable schematic of the processor district's sub-level access network done by nightfall. Something that could be copied and distributed. Something that might be useful to someone else at some future point, in some other settlement facing a compliance sweep. I stopped walking. 30 people stopped with me, in the middle of the street, in the thin morning light of Harrow's Rest, in the quiet of a settlement that had just watched its suppression grid fail, and was still working out what that meant. I looked at them, 30 people, a compliance officer, an old man already making notes, a cartographer with a notebook out, 2 twins who had been running for 15 years, and were, by all appearances, done running, a 17-year-old boy who had a sky inside him that could stop a field team cold. The council would reconvene. They would write new protocols. They would send new vessels to new settlements and knock on new doors. And the work would be hard and the losses would be real. And nothing about the next years was going to be simple. We would not be doing it alone. That was the thing that had changed. That was what the 41-0 vote had failed to account for. The vote had been about elimination, and elimination only works on isolated targets. You cannot eliminate a thing that has already found itself. You can only manage it, and management in the long run is a losing position. We were dangerous, just not in any way their models had room for. I didn't dream that night. There was no need. The world, for the first time in my life, was doing it for me.